They laughed when the quiet woman bent down to wipe champagne from her dress beside the infinity pool, never realizing they were humiliating the one person whose name could erase them from that resort by sunrise. The Pacific sunset spilled gold across the marble terraces of Holloway Cove Resort, painting the ocean in streaks of orange and crimson, while wealthy guests drifted between glowing fire pits with crystal glasses in hand. Everything about the place whispered exclusivity. The soft piano music floating through hidden speakers, the scent of jasmine carried by the coastal breeze, the polished servers moving silently with silver trays balanced perfectly at shoulder height. It was the kind of resort where people arrived to be seen. And that evening, Vanessa Sterling intended to own every eye in the room. Wrapped in a shimmering designer gown that caught the fading sunlight like liquid metal, Vanessa stood near the infinity pool surrounded by a circle of equally polished friends, laughing too loudly, speaking just loudly enough for nearby guests to hear the names she casually dropped into conversation. Senators, athletes, CEOs. The performance of wealth came naturally to her. Across the terrace, Claire Bennett walked alone. At 38, Claire carried herself with a quiet calm that seemed strangely untouched by the luxury surrounding her. Her pale linen dress moved softly in the ocean wind, and a simple leather tote rested against her shoulder. No jewelry except for a thin silver bracelet. No designer logos. No attempt to impress anyone. She paused briefly beside the pool, watching the waves crash against the cliffs below as though the ocean interested her more than the people. Several guests barely glanced at her before dismissing her entirely. To them, she looked like someone who didn't belong. Vanessa noticed her immediately. Women like Vanessa always noticed women like Claire. Quiet people unsettled her. Housekeeping's getting brave these days. One man joked under his breath as Claire passed nearby. A few soft laughs followed. Claire kept walking without reacting. Vanessa smirked as she lifted her champagne glass. "No, seriously," she said loud. Enough for others to hear. How does someone dressed like that even get into a five-star resort? More laughter spread through the terrace. Heads turned now. The social energy shifted with cruel curiosity. Claire finally stopped near the edge of the pool, slowly turning toward the voices behind her. Her expression remained calm. Almost too calm. Vanessa stepped closer, heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. "Excuse me," she said with a smile that carried no warmth at all. "Private guest event." Claire met her eyes politely. "I'm aware." That answer irritated Vanessa more than any apology would have. She glanced toward her friends, silently inviting the audience deeper into the humiliation. "Well," Vanessa continued, sipping her champagne, "staff entrances are usually around back." A few guests laughed harder this time. One woman covered her mouth to hide it. Another lifted her phone slightly, already recording. Claire lowered her gaze briefly, noticing a streak of champagne dripping onto the front of her dress. During the exchange, Vanessa's glass had tipped carelessly forward. Or perhaps not carelessly at all. Tiny drops shimmered against the pale fabric under the resort lights. "Oh no," Vanessa said without sounding sorry. "What a shame." The group burst into laughter again. But Claire didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She simply reached into her tote, removed a folded white napkin, and calmly knelt beside the pool to blot the stain. And somehow, that silence made the scene feel even uglier. Nearby conversations faded. Even the piano music seemed distant for a moment. Claire's movements stayed steady and graceful, untouched by embarrassment. A longtime bartender watching from inside the terrace doors suddenly stiffened with recognition. His expression changed instantly. Not fear. Something closer to disbelief. Because unlike the others laughing beside the infinity pool, he knew exactly who the quiet woman was. The bartender's name was Samuel Reed, and during his 14 years working at Holloway Cove Resort, he had seen movie stars scream at valets, hedge fund executives tip $5 after ordering $10,000 dinners, and socialites reduce young servers to tears over seating arrangements. But the moment he saw Claire Bennett kneeling beside the infinity pool with champagne soaking into her linen dress, something inside him tightened instantly. He set down the crystal glass he had been polishing and stared through the terrace doors in disbelief. "No way," he whispered under his breath. Beside him, a younger bartender frowned. "You know her?" Samuel did not answer immediately. Outside, Vanessa Sterling was still smiling for her audience, clearly enjoying the attention. The guests around her shifted closer, sensing entertainment. Expensive watches glimmered beneath the terrace lights as phones subtly angled for better recording positions. Claire finished blotting the stain and rose slowly to her feet with quiet dignity, smoothing the front of her dress as though the humiliation mattered less to her than keeping the evening peaceful. That composure irritated Vanessa even more. People like Vanessa thrived on visible embarrassment, and Claire was refusing to give her any. "You should probably get someone to clean that properly," Vanessa said sweetly. "Salt water stains are difficult to remove." A few guests laughed again, softer this time. The energy around the terrace had begun to shift in ways they could not fully explain. Several older staff members standing near the restaurant entrance exchanged uneasy glances. One server suddenly looked down at the floor instead of participating in the laughter. Another quietly stepped backward and disappeared inside. Claire lifted her eyes toward Vanessa. Calm, steady, almost compassionate. "Thank you for your concern," she said softly. Vanessa blinked, caught off guard by the politeness. Before she could respond, a sharply dressed event coordinator hurried onto the terrace, her face visibly pale. "Ms. Sterling," she said carefully, forcing a smile. "Perhaps we should continue the welcome reception inside." Vanessa barely acknowledged her. "We are fine right here." The coordinator's eyes flicked nervously toward Claire for less than a second before dropping again. That tiny movement did not go unnoticed by Samuel behind the bar. He knew that. Look, staff members only looked at Claire that way when they recognized her, but were too afraid to say her name aloud. Years earlier, Samuel had seen Claire walking the unfinished property in work boots beside the original developers, long before the resort became famous. While wealthy investors obsessed over profits, Claire had spent hours speaking with housekeepers, landscapers, and kitchen staff, insisting every employee deserved ocean view break rooms and full health benefits. Most guests never knew those details. They only saw marble floors and infinity pools, but many longtime workers quietly called her the soul of Holloway Cove. Outside, Vanessa crossed her arms. "You know," she said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, "places like this have standards. It ruins the atmosphere when random people wander into private events pretending they belong." The sentence hung over the terrace like smoke. A man near the fire pit chuckled awkwardly, but nobody joined him this time. Claire remained silent for a moment, the ocean wind moving strands of blonde hair gently across her face. Then she asked one simple question. "Is Mr. Holloway attending tonight?" The reaction was immediate. The coordinator froze. Samuel nearly dropped the bottle in his hand. And for the first time all evening, uncertainty flickered across Vanessa Sterling's face. She laughed quickly to cover it. "Mr. Holloway does not attend events with people like you." Claire nodded once, almost to herself. "I see." Her voice carried no anger, no challenge. But somehow those two words made the terrace feel colder. Because hidden beneath the music and ocean breeze, something invisible had just begun to change. Vanessa Sterling had spent years mastering the art of controlling a room. At charity galas in Manhattan, rooftop parties in Miami, and private yacht events along the California coast, she understood one simple truth better than most people. Crowds followed confidence, not kindness. And until that moment beside the infinity pool, the entire terrace had belonged to her. But Claire Bennett's quiet question had unsettled something invisible in the air. The laughter was fading now. Guests who had eagerly watched the humiliation minutes earlier suddenly found themselves avoiding eye contact with the woman in the linen dress. Vanessa noticed it immediately. Her smile tightened slightly as she lifted her champagne glass again, though her fingers no longer looked entirely steady. "You are asking about Richard Holloway?" she said with a laugh that sounded sharper than before. "That is adorable." A few guests forced polite chuckles, but the sound lacked confidence now. Claire remained calm beneath the golden terrace lights. Ocean waves crashed softly below the cliffs while the evening breeze carried the faint scent of salt and jasmine through the silence growing around them. "I only asked whether he was attending," Claire replied. The event coordinator beside Vanessa swallowed nervously. Her name tag read Melissa Grant, though at that moment she looked less like an executive and more like someone trying desperately not to say the wrong thing. She glanced toward the resort entrance again. "Ms. Sterling," Melissa said carefully, "perhaps we should relocate the guests before the founder's arrival." Vanessa frowned. "Founder?" The single word slipped out before she could stop herself. Melissa instantly regretted speaking. Claire lowered her eyes briefly, almost as though she pitied the woman standing in front of her. That only made Vanessa angrier. I think we are done entertaining this, Vanessa snapped. She turned toward two security staff members stationed near the terrace stairs. Excuse me, could you please escort her out of the VIP reception area? The sentence landed heavily across the marble terrace. One of the guards started forward automatically before suddenly slowing down. His older partner placed a hand lightly against his arm. Both men were staring directly at Claire now. Recognition had begun spreading through the staff like electricity. The younger guard looked confused. The older one looked terrified. Vanessa crossed her arms impatiently. Well, neither guard moved. Around the terrace, whispers quietly began replacing laughter. A woman near the fire pit lowered her phone. A businessman who had been smirking minutes earlier slowly stepped backward, sensing danger without understanding why. Claire stood perfectly still in the center of it all, her stained dress moving gently in the wind while the sunset painted soft gold across her face. Then, from somewhere inside the resort lobby, a sudden commotion broke the silence. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed across marble floors. Several employees rushed toward the entrance at once, straightening uniforms, adjusting ties, checking radios. The atmosphere changed instantly. Even guests who knew nothing about business could feel it. Someone important had arrived. Vanessa looked toward the lobby with visible annoyance. What now? She muttered. Samuel stepped out from behind the bar at last. His voice remained respectful, but his face had turned pale. Ms. Sterling, he said quietly, I think you should stop talking. Vanessa stared at him in disbelief. Excuse me. Samuel did not answer, because at that exact moment, every employee along the terrace suddenly stood straighter. Conversation stopped entirely, and through the glowing lobby doors, surrounded by senior executives in dark tailored suits, Richard Holloway finally entered the resort. The billionaire founder of Holloway Cove rarely attended public receptions anymore. But the instant his eyes scanned the terrace and landed on Claire Bennett standing alone beside the infinity pool, his entire expression changed. Richard Holloway was not a man people ignored. At 64, the founder of Holloway Cove Resorts carried the kind of presence that money alone could never purchase. His silver hair was perfectly combed, his navy suit tailored with quiet precision, and even the way he walked across the marble lobby commanded immediate attention. Executives followed several steps behind him carrying tablets and folders, struggling to keep pace as he moved through the resort with calm authority. Guests straightened instinctively when they recognized him. Employees lowered their eyes respectfully. But the moment Richard stepped onto the terrace and saw Claire Bennett standing beside the infinity pool with champagne stains across her dress, something inside him visibly hardened. The billionaire stopped. Walking. Complete silence followed. Vanessa Sterling's confident smile faded for the first time all evening. Richard's eyes moved slowly from Claire to the surrounding guests, then finally toward the half-empty champagne glass still resting in Vanessa's hand. Nobody spoke. Nobody even seemed willing to breathe too loudly. The ocean wind whispered softly through the terrace while firelight flickered across uneasy faces. Then Richard Holloway did something no one expected. He walked past every executive, every celebrity guest, every wealthy investor waiting to greet him, and stopped directly in front of Claire. His expression softened instantly. Claire, he said quietly. You came. Several guests exchanged stunned looks. Vanessa blinked rapidly, confusion spreading across her face. Claire offered a small polite smile. I did not want to miss the anniversary event. Richard noticed the stain on her dress immediately. His eyes darkened. What happened? Before Claire could answer, Melissa Grant stepped forward nervously. Sir, there seems to have been a misunderstanding among some of the guests. Richard turned slowly toward Melissa. The disappointment in his face was somehow worse than anger. A misunderstanding, he repeated softly. Nobody moved. Vanessa forced a laugh, desperate to regain control of the situation. Mr. Holloway, I am Vanessa Sterling. We were only trying to protect the integrity of your private reception. This woman entered the event area without proper identification, and Richard looked at her once. Just once. And Vanessa stopped speaking mid-sentence. The silence that followed felt enormous. Samuel watched from behind the bar as realization finally began spreading through the crowd. Guests who had laughed earlier now stared at Claire with growing disbelief. Some quietly lowered their phones. Others stepped farther away from Vanessa, instinctively distancing themselves from what they suddenly sensed had become a disaster. Richard faced Claire again. "I am deeply sorry," he said. "You should never have been treated this way here." Claire glanced briefly around the terrace. Her calmness remained almost unsettling. "The staff were not the problem," she replied softly. Richard nodded once, understanding more from that sentence than anyone else there could possibly understand. Because 12 years earlier, when Holloway Cove existed only as blueprints and financial risk, Richard Holloway had been preparing to abandon the entire project. Investors had withdrawn. Construction costs exploded. Lawyers advised him to cut employee programs and redesign the property for faster profit margins. But one person refused to let him destroy the vision: Claire Bennett. While executives chased luxury branding, Claire had insisted the resort should feel human before it felt expensive. She designed the employee housing programs, the wellness gardens, the scholarship fund for staff families. Even the oceanfront terrace where the guests now stood humiliating her had originally been Claire's idea after she argued that beauty should never feel intimidating. Most people never learned her name because Claire never wanted recognition. She quietly disappeared from public business life after her husband passed away years earlier. Richard never forgot what she built. And now, standing beneath the resort lights, surrounded by the very people who mocked her simplicity, Richard Holloway looked toward the guests with visible disappointment. "Every single thing this resort represents," he said slowly, "exists because of her." The terrace fell completely silent. The silence that settled across the terrace no longer felt awkward. It felt heavy, like the entire resort itself had suddenly become aware of something shameful unfolding beneath its own lights. Vanessa Sterling stood frozen beside the infinity pool, her champagne glass still hanging loosely in her hand, while Richard Holloway's words echoed through the crowd. "Every single thing this resort represents exists because of her." Nobody laughed anymore. The same guests who had smirked minutes earlier now stared at Claire Bennett with expressions shifting between disbelief and embarrassment. A man near the fire pit quietly slipped his phone back into his jacket pocket. A woman who had recorded part of the confrontation suddenly lowered her eyes toward the marble floor. Even the ocean breeze seemed quieter somehow. Vanessa tried to recover first. People like her always did. "I think there has been some confusion," she said carefully, forcing another smile onto her face. "No one intended disrespect." Richard turned toward her slowly. "You asked security to remove her." Vanessa swallowed. "I was protecting the event." "From whom?" Richard asked calmly. The question landed harder than if he had shouted. Vanessa opened her mouth, but no answer came. Because for the first time that evening, she heard her own behavior the way everyone else now heard it. Cruel, petty, small. Claire remained still beside the pool, showing no satisfaction in Vanessa's humiliation. That unsettled the guests even more. Most people understood anger. They understood revenge. But Claire carried neither. Her quiet restraint forced everyone else to sit alone with their own discomfort. Richard exhaled slowly before turning toward the surrounding crowd. "Many years ago," he said, his voice carrying easily across the terrace, "when investors wanted this property redesigned for higher profits, Claire fought to protect the people who worked here." Several employees standing near the restaurant entrance lowered their heads respectfully. Richard continued. "While others argued about wealth and exclusivity, she argued that dignity mattered more. She believed luxury should never make ordinary people feel invisible." The words spread across the terrace like a mirror, forcing everyone to see themselves clearly. Vanessa's face lost color. Samuel watched quietly as the realization deepened around the room. Guests remembered their laughter, their whispers, their silence while another human being was publicly humiliated over a linen dress and simple sandals. Richard looked toward Claire again, softer now. "You disappeared from all of this after Michael passed away," he said gently. "Most people assumed you never wanted to return." For the first time that evening, emotion flickered briefly across Claire's face. Michael Bennett had been her husband for 20 years before cancer took him 6 winters earlier. After his death, Claire withdrew from business life almost entirely, quietly, dedicating herself to charity work and educational foundations across small coastal towns. Very few people connected the reserved woman standing beside the pool to the visionary who helped build one of the most respected luxury resorts in the country. Claire glanced toward the ocean. "I did not come back for recognition," she said softly. "I only wanted to see whether the place still remembered what it was meant to become." The sentence hit harder than anyone expected, because suddenly the humiliation no longer belonged only to Vanessa Sterling. It belonged to the entire terrace. Every guest who laughed, every person who watched silently, every employee too afraid to intervene. Richard's expression darkened with disappointment as he slowly looked around the crowd. "And tonight," he said quietly, "I am not sure we passed that test." Absolute silence followed. No music, no clinking glasses, only the distant sound of waves crashing below the cliffs, while dozens of wealthy strangers stood speechless beneath the glow of the resort lights, unable to escape the uncomfortable truth Claire Bennett had exposed without ever raising her voice. No one knew where to look after Richard Holloway's words settled over the terrace. Some guests stared at the ocean to avoid meeting Claire Bennett's eyes. Others quietly stepped away from Vanessa Sterling as though embarrassment itself might spread by proximity. The golden light from the fire pits flickered across uneasy faces while the infinity pool reflected the darkening sky like glass. Holloway Cove had hosted presidents, movie stars, and billionaires over the years, but in that moment the most powerful force on the terrace was not wealth. It was shame. Vanessa felt it first. Real shame. Not the polished social embarrassment she knew how to laugh away at cocktail parties, but something deeper and colder. She looked around slowly and realized the crowd that had supported her minutes earlier had disappeared emotionally. Nobody smiled at her anymore. Nobody defended her. Even her closest friends had taken small steps backward, quietly distancing themselves from the disaster unfolding under the resort lights. Vanessa cleared her throat. "I did not know who she was," she said carefully, trying to regain control of the moment. Claire's expression did not change. Richard Holloway looked directly at Vanessa for several long seconds before speaking. "That," he said quietly, "is exactly the problem." The sentence landed with brutal simplicity. Several employees lowered their heads immediately. Vanessa's lips parted slightly, but no response came. Because deep down, she understood the truth in what he meant. Claire should not have needed status to deserve respect. The silence returned again. Heavy, unforgiving. Samuel noticed Melissa Grant standing near the terrace entrance, gripping her event clipboard so tightly her knuckles had turned white. She looked devastated. Unlike Vanessa, Melissa understood exactly what Claire's disappointment could mean. Holloway Cove's entire company culture had been built around values Claire Bennett created years earlier. Compassion, dignity, humility. Employees attended seminars about it every year. Those values appeared framed inside executive offices and training centers across every property the company owned. Yet somehow, beneath the chandeliers and ocean views, everyone had forgotten them the moment they encountered someone who looked ordinary. Claire finally broke the silence herself. "Please do not punish the staff," she said softly. Several employees looked up in surprise. Richard frowned slightly. "Claire, most people follow the tone they are given," she continued gently. "Kindness becomes easier when leadership protects it." Her eyes drifted briefly toward Vanessa, but there was no hatred in them. Only sadness. That somehow felt worse. Vanessa lowered her gaze for the first time all evening. Nearby, one of the younger servers suddenly began crying quietly. She quickly turned away, embarrassed, but Claire noticed. "What is your name?" Claire asked gently. "Emily," the young woman whispered. "Emily," Claire said softly. "You do not need to cry." The kindness in her voice broke something fragile inside the atmosphere around them. Samuel saw several employees blinking back emotion now. Because they remembered. They remembered the woman who used to sit in employee cafeterias asking dishwashers whether the food quality was good enough. The woman who fought executives to increase maternity leave for housekeeping staff. The woman who believed luxury meant making people feel valued, not intimidated. Richard exhaled slowly, looking out toward the dark Pacific horizon before speaking again. "Tonight was supposed to celebrate the anniversary of this resort," he said. "Instead, Claire reminded us why this place existed in the first place." The waves crashed softly below the cliffs. Somewhere in the distance, music from another ballroom continued faintly, unaware of the reckoning happening on the terrace above the ocean. Claire glanced down at the champagne stain still visible on her dress. Then she smiled very slightly. "It washes out," she said. The simplicity of those 3 words shattered the remaining arrogance in the room, because everyone understood she was no longer talking about the dress. The terrace remained suspended in silence long after Claire Bennett spoke those 3 simple words. It washes out. The ocean wind moved gently through the palms surrounding the infinity pool while the last traces of sunset faded into deep navy across the Pacific sky. One by one, guests began setting their champagne glasses down untouched. The mood of the evening had completely transformed. What started as entertainment had become reflection. Richard Holloway slowly removed his suit jacket and handed it quietly to Claire. "At least let me replace the dress," he said softly. Claire smiled faintly as she accepted the jacket, though she draped it loosely over her shoulders rather than putting it on. "The dress is not important," she replied. Richard looked at her for a long moment. "You always say that," he murmured. Nearby, Vanessa Sterling stood motionless, trapped inside a humiliation she no longer knew how to escape. Her makeup remained flawless. Her posture remained elegant. But the confidence that once controlled the terrace had vanished completely. For perhaps the first time in years, Vanessa had been forced to confront a truth no amount of wealth or social status could shield her from. She had mistaken simplicity for insignificance. One of her friends leaned closer and whispered something quietly, but Vanessa barely reacted. She was staring at Claire now with an expression far different from arrogance. It looked almost like regret. Around them, longtime employees slowly began emerging from inside the resort. Housekeepers, servers, concierge staff, maintenance workers. Many had worked at Holloway Cove for over a decade. Several recognized Claire immediately the moment Richard revealed the truth, and word had spread quickly through the property. An older housekeeper named Rosa stepped hesitantly onto the terrace, her hands trembling slightly. "Mrs. Bennett?" she asked softly. Claire turned instantly, her face warming with genuine recognition. "Rosa?" The older woman's eyes filled with tears. "You remember me?" Claire looked surprised by the question. "Of course I do. Your grandson wanted to study engineering." Rosa covered her mouth emotionally. "He graduated last spring," she whispered. "Full scholarship." Claire's eyes brightened. "That is wonderful." Guests watched the exchange in stunned silence. The people surrounding Claire were not powerful investors or celebrities. They were employees, ordinary workers, and every single one of them seemed to look at her with deep affection rather than obligation. That realization hit harder than Richard Holloway's speech ever could. Vanessa noticed it too. Respect built from kindness always looked different from respect built from status. One could disappear the moment power faded. The other remained quietly alive inside people for years. Melissa Grant finally stepped forward again, visibly emotional now. "Mrs. Bennett," she said softly, "I am so sorry for what happened tonight." Claire shook her head gently. "Then make sure the next person who walks in dressed simply is treated better." Melissa nodded immediately, unable to speak past the emotion in her throat. Samuel watched the crowd carefully from behind the bar. The change in atmosphere was extraordinary. Earlier that evening, guests competed for attention with loud laughter and expensive stories. Now nobody seemed interested in impressing anyone anymore. Conversations had softened. Postures changed. The entire terrace felt quieter. Smaller somehow. More human. Richard glanced toward the ocean before speaking once more. "Do you know why Claire refused to put her name on any building here?" he asked the crowd. Nobody answered. Richard smiled faintly. "Because she believed true generosity should feel invisible." The sentence settled deeply across the terrace. Vanessa slowly lowered her eyes. Invisible. That was exactly how they had treated Claire when she first walked into the resort. Not because she lacked value, but because they could not see past appearances long enough to recognize it. Claire looked around the terrace one final time, her calm eyes moving across the same crowd that had laughed at her less than an hour earlier. And somehow, without anger or revenge or humiliation, she had made every person there confront the kind of human being they had chosen to become. The night air above Holloway Cove Resort carried a strange stillness now, as though the ocean itself had quieted to listen. The laughter that once filled the terrace had vanished completely, replaced by low whispers and thoughtful silence beneath the warm glow of lantern lights. Claire Bennett stood near the infinity pool with Richard Holloway's jacket resting softly across her shoulders, surrounded not by admiration for wealth, but by something far rarer. Respect honestly earned. One of the executives standing behind Richard stepped forward cautiously with a tablet in hand. "Sir," he said quietly, "the board members are waiting in the ballroom for the anniversary presentation." Richard barely looked at him. His attention remained on Claire. "They can wait." The executive nodded immediately and stepped back without another word. Guests noticed the exchange. Even the most powerful people in the company deferred to Claire's presence without hesitation. Vanessa Sterling saw it too, and the realization settled heavily across her face. All evening, she had measured importance through appearance, status, and influence. Yet the woman she mocked had entered the resort with none of those things displayed outwardly, and still commanded more genuine respect than anyone else. On the terrace, Vanessa slowly approached Claire at last. The movement immediately drew attention from nearby guests and staff alike. No one interrupted. Vanessa stopped several feet away, suddenly seeming uncertain of herself for the first time in years. Her voice, once sharp with confidence, sounded quieter now. "Mrs. Bennett," she said carefully, "I owe you an apology." The terrace remained silent. Claire looked at her calmly, but said nothing. Vanessa swallowed before continuing. "I judged you before I knew anything about you." Claire's expression softened slightly. "No," she replied gently. "You judged me because you thought you already knew." The sentence landed softly, but its truth cut deeper than humiliation ever could. Vanessa lowered her eyes again. Nearby, Samuel noticed several guests subtly nodding to themselves, as though Claire had spoken aloud something they suddenly recognized inside their own behavior too. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Vanessa surprised everyone. She set her untouched champagne glass onto a nearby table and quietly turned toward one of the servers she had ignored earlier that evening. "Thank you for your work tonight," she said awkwardly. The young server blinked in visible shock before offering a small smile. It was not a dramatic moment. No applause followed, but Claire noticed it immediately, and so did Richard. Change rarely arrived through grand speeches. Sometimes it began with embarrassment honest enough to become humility. Claire glanced out toward the dark Pacific horizon again. Far below the cliffs, waves rolled endlessly beneath the moonlight, while soft jazz drifted faintly from the ballroom inside the resort. Holloway Cove looked beautiful from the outside, but tonight had reminded everyone how fragile beauty became when kindness disappeared from it. Richard stepped beside Claire quietly. "You were right," he admitted. "Somewhere along the way, we started protecting the image of this place more than the people inside it." Claire gave a faint smile. That happens when luxury becomes performance instead of care. Several executives standing nearby shifted uncomfortably at those words because they knew she was correct. Over the years, the company had expanded aggressively. New investors arrived. Marketing campaigns focused more on exclusivity and prestige. Slowly, without realizing it, the culture Claire once fought to build had begun drifting toward exactly the kind of arrogance she feared most. Yet somehow, one quiet woman standing beside a pool in a stained linen dress had exposed that truth more clearly than any corporate report ever could. Richard looked around the terrace at the employees, guests, and executives gathered under the resort lights. "Tomorrow morning," he announced calmly, "every department head will attend a new training session personally designed by Mrs. Bennett." A ripple of surprise moved through the crowd. Claire looked at him with mild amusement. "You already decided that?" Richard smiled faintly. "I learned years ago not to wait for permission when you are right." For the first time all evening, a few soft laughs finally returned to the terrace. But this time, the laughter sounded different. Gentler, humble, human. By the time the anniversary reception finally ended, Holloway Cove Resort no longer felt like the same place. The marble terraces still gleamed beneath the lantern lights. The infinity pool still reflected the moonlit Pacific in perfect silver waves. Guests still wore designer suits and elegant gowns worth more than most people's monthly rent. But something invisible had shifted beneath all the luxury. The arrogance was gone. Conversations became softer as people slowly filtered toward the ballroom or drifted quietly back to their suites. Employees walked with straighter posture now, no longer blending into the background like invisible furniture for wealthy strangers. It was as though Claire Bennett's presence had reminded everyone that dignity was not reserved for people with status. It belonged to everyone. Claire stood near the edge of the terrace one final time, looking out across the dark ocean below the cliffs. Richard Holloway approached beside her, hands folded calmly behind his back. For several moments, neither of them spoke. The silence between them carried years of history, grief, gratitude, and respect too deep for dramatic words. Finally, Richard smiled faintly. Michael would have been proud tonight. Claire's eyes softened at the mention of her late husband. The breeze lifted strands of her blonde hair gently as she looked toward the horizon. Michael always believed people reveal their true character when they think no one important is watching, she said quietly. Richard nodded slowly. Turns out he was right. Behind them, Vanessa Sterling lingered alone near the fire pit long after her friends disappeared inside. Earlier that evening, she had commanded the attention of the entire terrace with effortless confidence. Now she looked smaller somehow, more thoughtful. Before leaving, Vanessa approached one of the housekeepers collecting empty glasses and quietly offered to help carry a tray back inside. The older woman looked stunned but accepted with a shy smile. Claire noticed the exchange from a distance, but said nothing. She did not need public apologies or dramatic punishment. Watching someone choose humility on their own was enough. Samuel began closing the outdoor bar for the night when Claire walked over quietly. "You recognized me immediately," she said with a faint smile. Samuel laughed softly. "Mrs. Bennett, you once spent 40 minutes helping my daughter fill out college applications in the employee cafeteria." Claire seemed genuinely surprised. "How is she doing?" "Second year of medical school," Samuel answered proudly. Claire's face lit with quiet happiness. "That is wonderful." Samuel shook his head in disbelief. "You remember things nobody else remembers." Claire glanced around the nearly empty terrace. "People are never small once you truly see them." The words settled deeply into Samuel's chest, because that had always been Claire Bennett's rarest gift. She noticed people the world overlooked. The exhausted server, the nervous housekeeper, the lonely bartender, the quiet guest sitting alone near the ocean. Long before Holloway Cove became famous for luxury, it became unforgettable because one woman insisted every person inside it deserved to feel valued. Richard eventually checked his watch and sighed softly. "The board meeting tomorrow morning should be interesting." Claire smiled faintly. "Good." He looked at her carefully. "Are you staying long this time?" Claire paused before answering. For years after Michael's death, she avoided places filled with memories. Holloway Cove carried too many of them. But tonight had changed something. Not because people finally recognized her importance. That never mattered to Claire. What mattered was seeing that kindness still had the power to wake people up when they were willing to listen. "Maybe a little longer," she said softly. Richard smiled. Together they looked out toward the moonlit Pacific while the last guests disappeared from the terrace behind them. And somewhere beneath the sound of crashing waves and distant music, Holloway Cove quietly remembered what it was always meant to be. Not a monument to wealth, but a place where people felt seen. Because in the end, true class was never revealed by designer clothes, private events, or expensive champagne. It was revealed in how someone treated the person they believed had nothing to offer them.